Hi, I thought it would be fun to make a video, make several videos telling stories, and hopefully some people at University House might be interested in seeing them. So the first story I want to tell is about my uncle. He was a great guy. All the kids loved him. He had a slight drinking problem, but when he got drunk, which was often in the evening, he would just get very jovial and sing a lot of songs and tell a lot of stories, and he was one of the few adults that paid any attention to the children. He was married to a woman that none of us liked. She seemed pretty much a bitch and was very negative. She didn't like children. She didn't seem to like much, and she used to retire to bed early on, and we would gather with Uncle Frank in the kitchen and play games and have a good time. So I heard the story always when he would get a little intoxicated, he would mention Isabelle. And just the way he said the name, he would say, Isabelle. And you knew there was a story there. And he would tell us that Isabelle was the one true love of his life, that he was always had been and always would be in love with Isabelle. And it turned out that when he was a young man, and his father, my grandfather, was very insistent that the family would become nouveau riche, go ahead in society. And my Uncle Frank, the Isabelle that he fell in love with, was a dry goods grocer's daughter. So he really loved her, and all the time when he was seeing her, there was a very high class society woman, Betty, who was apparently in love with Uncle Frank. And one day, just as Uncle Frank and Isabelle were about to announce their marriage, Uncle Frank's father called him into the study and said that if he married Isabelle, he would be cast off from the family. He would never see his mother or his siblings again. And since Uncle Frank really wanted to go to law school at the time, his father, who was very influential in the legal field, said he would also make sure that Frank would never get into any of the good legal schools. He would never get any money. He would never get any support. And in other words, he was very, very negative about Uncle Frank marrying Isabelle. So Uncle Frank was in a big dilemma about what to do. He did not want to be cast off from the family. He really wanted to study the law. And his father threw everything in his father's power against the idea of Isabelle and Frank marrying. Right at the time when Uncle Frank was trying to make his decision, he got a call from the hospital. And it turned out that the beautiful high society young woman who had fallen in love with Frank, was in a coma. She was very near death, they told Uncle Frank, and the only word that she would utter that they could understand coming from out of the coma was Frank, Frank. And they asked if he would possibly be willing to come down and see this beautiful woman just before she died who was calling his name. So he went down to the intensive care unit, or the equivalent thereof, and he saw this beautiful woman, and indeed she was calling his name. And somehow that was the last straw, I guess. So between the beautiful young woman calling his name and his father saying he would never see his family again and never get any money and never any support, Frank broke it off with Isabelle. And they were very, very sad, but just the reason for the breakup was that she was a dry goods grocer's daughter. So the years went by, and we all knew the story of Uncle Frank's tragic love for Isabelle, and we all wondered about her. So at some point, Uncle Frank died after maybe, I don't know how many years, and my older sister Ginny was a member of a sorority at the University of Michigan called Cirrhosis. And she was serving tea for the alumni and friends of the Cirrhosis sorority, and she had her name on the program, and her name at that time was Virginia Sims Coffin. Now, Sims was my grandfather, Frank's last name, and my grandfather's last name, and it only had one M, so it was kind of a rare name, Sims. And my grandfather had paid anybody in the family who would put Sims somewhere in the name of their child got $100, which at that time was quite a significant sum. My mom and dad had been struggling for money, and so when they had their first child, I think they were willing, without too much opposition, to have their first daughter be Virginia Sims Coffin. So my sister is serving tea at the cirrhosis sorority, and her name is in the program. And while the tea is being served, this beautiful older woman, I picture as being kind of looking like Meryl Streep or Emma Thompson, maybe. Anyway, she came up to the table and she said to Ginny, "Excuse me, I saw your name in the program. I couldn't help wondering if you are by any chance related to Frank Sims." And my sister paused for a moment and thought and looked at the woman, and then she said, "Isabelle." And the woman went, "Ah," and Ginny went, "Ah," and they both, and the woman started to cry, and Ginny started to cry, and Ginny said, "You know, we all loved Uncle Frank, and for the whole of his life, he always talked about how wonderful you were and how much he loved you and how sorry he was that he couldn't stand up to pressure, and he never forgot you." And so they had this wonderful interaction at the cirrhosis tea. And I told that story to my cousin Barb many years later, and she said, "Oh my goodness, I now understand. When I was young and in love, and Uncle Frank was in his 60s at that time, I went to him and I said, 'Uncle Frank, I don't know what to do. I'm in love with this man, but my family doesn't want me to marry him.' And she started to go into an explanation, and Uncle Frank said, 'Wait a minute, stop right there. Do you love him?' And Barb said, 'Yes, I do.' And Uncle Frank then said, 'For God's sake, marry her.' So that's the story of my Uncle Frank and Isabelle, and I hope it's kept you entertained for a few moments. If you have a family story you'd like to share with me, please do. Thank you for listening.